All right, so introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Leo Plekhanov, PsyD. Um, I'm working on a project of looking at how psilocybe cubensis, which is a species of magic mushroom, how it influences my depression.
All right, and so for everybody out there, this is basically our is this our third take?
Uh, yes.
Yes. So we tried recording this a few times before, but my little recording device crashed. So this probably isn't going to seem as spontaneous as the previous efforts, but we're going to try to keep it fresh and interesting. Basically talking about your experience with psychedelic mushrooms, right?
Yes.
It's like a less academic way to phrase it.
Yeah.
And just, for the purposes of full disclosure, I know you personally. So for people who are wondering, like, how do these people know each other? Well, there it is. I've known him since elementary school. And what other disclosure is there? Oh, yes. Or a sort of statement that I can make. Um, I don't necessarily agree with everything he's going to say, although I don't necessarily disagree with it either. That's sort of a general kind of statement. So I guess go ahead and relate your experiences.
Okay. So, I started taking magic mushrooms on April 6th, and my significant other purchased the grow supplies for me, the grow bags and the spores, on a whim. She just saw them for sale and bought them and gave them to me, not really knowing my interest with magic mushrooms. But I've been interested in them for a long time. I was a little afraid of them until recently. The DARE program scared me from elementary school.
Yeah.
So it worked as intended, and took me until I got into my 30s to consider magic mushrooms and marijuana, because I use them both in concert to treat my depression with great effect. My depression used to be, so this is if I'm not on SSRIs or in psychotherapy treatment. This is just me
So
unmedicated.
what is SSRIs? Not
Uh,
everyone's going to know what those
oh
are.
yeah,
In fact, I barely know what they are.
they're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Um, they make the serotonin in your system stay out, so the serotonin interacts more with neurotransmitters as opposed to going back into this reuptake storage. I guess it's kind of a simplified way of putting it. It's just antidepressants. So I took
Yeah.
a generic version of Zoloft, citrulline, but it didn't really help my depression that much. So if I'm unmedicated, my depression, according to the Beck Depression Inventory, is in the 30s, which is quite severe.
Yeah.
Symptoms would be like crying spells, preoccupation with death, general malaise, reduced concentration, just an overall reduced functioning. So when I had SSRIs, my depression would be in the like 16 to 22 range, which is mild to moderate depression. So a good decrease, but still not gone. And then with magic mushrooms, my depression's in around 9, which is subclinical. So that would be normal ups and downs of life, no sign of depression.
Yeah.
So the treatments have been really successful.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize that as far as the people I know, you're not one of the ones that I would have characterized as like a hippie, as somebody who would regularly try something like magic mushrooms. And in fact, I myself don't do that kind of stuff, or like I I can't say I've never tried marijuana or edible marijuana, but I certainly don't do it regularly or anything like that. So we're not like a drug den over here, I guess is how I might say it. Right?
Yeah, it wasn't until the pandemic that I even considered marijuana, because the DARE program made me think of it as something that just kind of like alcohol, something that's a
Yeah.
depressant and kind of makes people less functional for a few hours. And it wasn't until the pandemic where I started watching a lot of these free online trainings on medical marijuana use. And then I started to look at the utility, and I tried it myself originally for sleep. And it helps a lot. And for a long time, it was my respite from depression. There'd be this segment of the evening where I could almost be guaranteed not to be depressed.
Yeah.
Because I would only use marijuana after 5 p.m. because it makes me too unproductive to use any earlier than that.
And of course, people who are strictly anti-marijuana, they tend to be paranoid about it themselves. Like they make it seem like it's going to be the end of the world. Yet marijuana is mostly legalized in the state of Michigan. And I can't say the entire state has fallen apart, you know?
Yeah. Like someone pointed out to me that someone I knew that worked at a head shop said that he knows a lot of construction workers, and about 90% of the construction workers he knows use marijuana regularly, but are still able to perform their job.
Yeah.
So it creates impairment, but there is also definitely a responsible use for it.
And of course, you know, in Michigan now, there are plenty of marijuana shops around. So there's definitely a demand for it. We know that.
Yeah.
So what about your experience with, you know, the magic mushrooms? What else can you say about that?
So the first time I did it, it felt like I could massage my whole body through my foot. Like I would touch a part of my foot and like feel muscle relief in the back of my neck. It was a very strange experience. I always kind of believed in reflexology as having like good applications and relief, but I never actually felt it other parts of my body. So that was very strange.
Well, it is true that, you know, so many different parts of our bodies are connected through nerves. Like if I touch part of my scalp, I might even be able to feel it in my arm or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I never had that before.
Yeah.
But I did kind of believe in it. Like I thought it was possible, or it made sense that nerves would connect everything. And the second trip I had of strong delirium where I would dance in my kitchen for a few hours, maybe like 2 or 3 hours. I'm not sure if it was that long because my sense of time is not cohesive. But I would dance in my kitchen and close my eyes, and it felt like I was in a whole different room.
Yeah.
That looked actually kind of like Yoda's hut in Star Wars, and there were these bizarre creatures that looked like a cross between a mouse and a fox, and
Wow.
they were speaking in like a weird, low, buzzing, vibrating sound that kind of reminded me of jazz with like a few random hisses. So it's like, and it was really cool. And I touched them, and I felt like electricity go up my arm. It was strange, and it was so for the purpose of the study, I decided to interpret that as dreamlike. So dream analysis, it's the contents of my consciousness.
Yeah.
So the hallucinations are coming from me. They're not elsewhere where other people can experience them. So that's how I want to interpret them, as just exploring the interior of my mind.
So as we discussed in our previous takes, attempting to record this episode, my experience, or one of my experiences actually trying marijuana, was with an edible, and I actually seem to only get the negative stereotypical side effects of it. Like I didn't really have control over my body so much. I didn't you know, like I would say something and I'd be like, did I actually say that? You know, and I was kind of like almost in a sleep state, I suppose, in a way. But I also think that I might have had some concussion symptoms at the time because I'd banged my head at work on like a shelf or something when I was changing the trash bags. So So what are your thoughts on that? Like the negative experiences?
I once spoke to a bud tender. I told her about there was a time where I had an edible from a bag, and it was a good experience. And the next day, I had the same number of edibles. It was 2 from a bag, but I got extremely high, and I felt like I was spinning, and then I threw up. And I asked the bud tender about it, and she said that what helps her if she's having a bad experience from THC is to take a CBD extract, and that seems to balance it out. Even if it's counterintuitive, it kind of balances the other side of the high. I haven't tried that, but that always seemed like a worthwhile plan if the effects are too strong.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of why I might have had that strong reaction too is because I don't do it regularly. That's probably another factor. Also, if I was to get like really drunk, I would obviously have some problems because I don't drink alcohol. So I think that was another reason. So did you have more of a harsh reaction during like some of your first experiences, or was it just fine?
It was usually really good.
Yeah.
So my first time taking an edible, I felt euphoric. Like it wasn't really on my radar that marijuana created euphoria. I guess it hadn't occurred to me, or maybe I heard about it, but for whatever reason didn't put it together that I would feel euphoric. And it was amazing to have this euphoria at night, whereas like nighttime depressive symptoms tend to increase. It was complete relief from that. And then I slept very well.
Yeah.
So the
So
bulk of my experiences are amazing with marijuana.
yeah. Well, I also mean like your other experiences with the
Oh, yeah.
mushrooms.
I have at this point I've tripped 4 times, and I haven't had a bad trip yet. They've all been really good. Um, they all kind of start out the same. So normally I'll eat a breakfast and then wait 3 hours because I want my stomach empty, and then
Yeah.
I'll eat mushrooms and I'll wait about a half hour to hit the bong. I prefer the bong.
Yeah.
Um, that's just my preferred technique. And so
So
there's
are you
nausea.
worried about, I don't know about addiction, but becoming too dependent on this?
The mushrooms, I don't think that's a problem because I take them once every 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I think that spacing is long enough that there really wouldn't be a chance to develop dependence.
Yeah.
Marijuana, I'm not quite a daily user, but I'm pretty close. So my usual use of marijuana is after 5 p.m. Sometime I'll segment a 4 to 6 hour span where I'll use marijuana, and that kind of keeps my tolerance relatively stable.
Yeah.
And then I frequently take 2-day breaks, so 2 consecutive days. I actually might do 2 days today and tomorrow, where I just don't use marijuana, and it's usually okay.
Yeah.
This pattern seems to prevent problems with dependence.
And what has this experience like changed any aspect of, I don't know, maybe worldview would be too significant of a term, but um just the way that you well, I guess sure, why not just say worldview? Has it changed your worldview at all?
I think so. So in my second trip, um, this might have been my biggest dose of psilocybin, although I don't know for sure. I'm dosing based on weight, which relative age of the mushroom can
Yeah.
influence how much psilocybin's in it. So younger mushrooms might have more than older mushrooms, for instance. But anyway, in my second trip, I would close my eyes and it would feel like millions of years went by. Like I had these lifetime experiences, which looking back, I view them more dreamlike, but they're very real and vivid in the moment. And so it felt like millions of years went by, and it seemed like I had reached this end of time thing
Hmm.
where nothing existed anymore. And I call it nirvana. Um, Although oblivion might be a better term. I think oblivion makes more sense to me, but nirvana also makes sense because there's a cessation of desire. There's nothing to want or need or really even think about. It's kind of this blissful non-existence, this extinguishing. And I didn't know I was Buddhist, I guess is kind of my response. Or maybe I'm still incredulous to being Buddhist, but it seemed like I experienced nirvana.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would call that oblivion or something else or just some trance state.
Well, I've been in manic states before, without taking any sort of substance. Well, I guess I shouldn't say without taking substances because even food and drink is a substance, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So how does this compare to like sort of a regular manic state, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've ever been fully manic, but I've worked with a lot of manic clients, so I've seen mania, and mania seems to have this, like often there's a grandiosity to it, or
Yeah.
with a lot of catastrophizing, or there's a lot of general cognitive distortions that come with manic states. People are pretty far removed from reality. And I could see the overlap of being far removed from reality here, but I would call this more of a delirium.
Yeah.
So manic states, one of the characteristics of mania is high levels of energy. And I have an elevated level of energy as evidenced by my dancing, because I dance
Yeah.
for hours on mushrooms, which I wouldn't normally do that. So I think there might be manic elements, but I think it's presented more in a delirium as opposed to anything else. I think if someone else watched me, they would see someone that's having a really hard time responding to external reality, just
Yeah.
doing their own thing.
Well, in the times where I've been like sort of in a manic phase, it's almost, I don't know, that there have been a few times where I kind of didn't have full control. And, that was without taking any sort of, drugs or whatever. So I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, control. It didn't feel like I lost control per se. Although I could see like my compulsion to dance could be an element of losing control, but activities like going to the bathroom or getting food were pretty easy still.
Yeah.
It would be hard because it's hard to see on mushrooms. Like stuff
Oh,
is
and,
kind
and
of moving and
I
crystalline
hate to
like.
interrupt you, but for the
Oh
people out there, I also wouldn't normally imagine you as somebody who dances too easily. You're not
yeah,
really the dancing type.
yeah. It usually takes some kind of illicit substance to get me to dance.
Yeah.
So I guess I could see like someone looking at this behavior being so unusual as being a manic episode. But there's something decidedly delirious about it too.
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah.
And I also want to mention, like, as far as I'm concerned, some people mistake me for being a straight edge guy because I don't regularly use substances, but that's almost more like a political movement or something like that. It's almost too purist.
Yeah.
Whereas in my case, I just don't do stuff, on a frequent basis or whatever. And I would also say that, even if you do something like drink a Mountain Dew or something, that's also altering your body in some way, or just regular activities, you get an endorphin rush. Basically, everything we do has to do with chemical reactions. You learn that if you've taken a chemistry class or, studied the physical sciences, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Endorphins can have some addictive qualities, even if it's not addiction in the usual sense, because you're not taking a foreign substance and putting it in your body. But people who run a lot and get like a runner's high definitely sit and get some sense of withdrawal when they don't have that.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you about that because, that endorphin rush is what some people call it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people like skydiving or taking, or making risky decisions or engaging in thrill-seeking behavior.
Yeah, it seems like it. I can remember being on roller coasters and feeling this profound relief from depression because it really makes me feel lively and
Yeah.
maybe awake, or maybe there's something with increasing the mind body connection that helps alleviate depression because it really tunes me into my body.
Well, I think you're also just forced to look at reality from a different perspective if you're on a roller coaster, or I guess even if you're not going on a roller coaster, just if you're in a different environment and having special experiences, it can seem more positive than, the humdrum existence that so many of us know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there anything else you would like to mention here? Like about your studies or
Yeah. I noticed a weird effect last night after I tripped. Um, I wrote about it. Maybe I could read this excerpt. It's a brief
okay.
excerpt. When I was in my kitchen, I had the thought, I'm so glad to have all of this, referring to my pantry. Spontaneous gratitude seems to be an important part of the mushroom delirium. The delirium is the freedom to dissolve and see everything as new and amazing. Peanut butter is no longer a routine or a chore of existence. It's bizarre and cool. How is it that anhedonia so often tries to take this from me? Anhedonia is like the aggressive boredom of depression. It's when nothing seems pleasurable.
Yeah.
Um, what was I? Oh, is the zest of life fleeting? In Taoism, the Tao is the indefinable experience. Is the zest of the moment something like that? Psilocybe cubensis certainly seems to make things zesty.
Zesty and full of life.
Yeah, so I think there's the way it changes the perspective, the way it makes everything seem so new and bizarre. I think that really does alleviate depression, and it does bring about a sense of gratitude that peanut butter, it's just kind of a routine, boring thing that I normally have, but now it's suddenly new again, as though I'd never had it.
Oh yeah, I would imagine there's a sense of wonder.
Yeah.
And that's something that a lot of people try to have, so they go out into nature and they go on these hikes and things like that because they want to feel exhilaration from just being around nature and beautiful scenery.
Yeah. That's a good point because people like life can be a little too rote and boring after a while. So doing something novel really changes that. And I wonder if mushrooms just make everything seem novel and new.
And I think part of it too is not to sound too anti-people, but I think getting away from people can really help sometimes in terms of alleviating depression, or because you're in some ways removing potential bad experiences or reminders of bad experiences.
Yeah, there's something with a performance side to being around people where we're performing
Yeah,
in a social setting as opposed to just being ourselves. And when you're alone, you can really be yourself.
that's true. Yeah.
I had this weird experience yesterday on mushrooms where I don't I don't know if this description would fit how I would have described it at the time. So keep that in mind. But it felt like I was pretending that I was a spider trying to take over my own body. Because my body felt weird. It felt like I had extra appendages, like legs that didn't really fit in my body. But it was kind of fun and weird to be a spider moving in a human body. It was very strange. And I could see that
But
being terrifying to people, but it also felt very playful and liberating to have the freedom. Because when do I get to pretend to be a spider taking over my own body? That's like something a 12-year-old me would do.
yeah. Well,
So there's,
when I was a kid, I would, me and my, not that this is exactly the same, but it kind of reminds me of it. But, just we'd put like the names of superheroes in a hat and we'd pick them out and we'd be those superheroes and fight each other. It's, what you just said sounds like something we would have done as kids for sure.
Yeah, so I think being alone and on mushrooms does give one the freedom to play
Yeah,
and the enthusiasm to play. Because I can be alone and not on mushrooms, but just too anhedonic to even bother to try to play with anything.
yeah. So, is there anything else you would like to mention about, like, I don't know, uh, playful experiences, I suppose?
Yeah. So a part of this research um, is inspired by Hunter S. Thompson, because he had this gonzo journalism, and I wanted to see if I could have a gonzo science, and something that's not a romanticized homage to Thompson, but something that kind of recognizes the recklessness and that it is the experience and it generates the experience. So I wanted to move beyond that. And when I recently rewatched Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and there's a lot of between the two actors that seems playful, like they're playing as opposed to being in the adult role of whatever it is they do.
Well, of course, they do put themselves in the dangerous situations, and
Yeah, but they're very playful and glib about it the whole time.
yeah.
Well, they're not terrified, I should say.
Well, really, part of the joke of that movie is that there's practically nothing that happens, and they have no enemies or no conflict other than with themselves and each other.
Yeah.
Like even the DEA types or the cops don't really give them any problems.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't really get that joke part of it, which is, if you actually stop and think about it, it's actually potentially hilarious.
Yeah, it is that like these
Literally
moments of
nobody, not even the anti-drug people, are actually, giving them problems of significance.
yeah. So it's kind of like they're really diving in the freedom to explore these altered states.
Yeah,
And it's funny though, like the whole thing's funny. Like we can't stop here. This is backcountry. It's a really
yeah,
bizarre experience that um kind of makes more sense if you've been there.
yeah. Well, I think my ex's dad, because we were watching that movie, and he happened to be there, and he said he couldn't watch it anymore because he understood it too well. It was too realistic for him.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because it's like I've seen bizarre things while tripping, but I think my attitude is so euphoric. Maybe that could be from the marijuana too, that it's
Yeah,
prompted me to be euphoric and more playful. But there's something about it that makes the bizarre experiences really fun and interesting.
yeah.
Whereas I could see, like, if I described them, like I felt like I was a spider trying to take over my own body. That could sound really terrifying to other people. Or
Oh yeah.
I close my eyes and I see these jazz speaking fox alien critters. That could be really off putting too.
Oh yeah. Well, so many different things that you could describe could be terrifying to people. And as somebody who's a lover of horror movies, I kind of have to deal with that all the time. The ways in which people have negative reactions to scary things, I guess you could say, or potentially scary things.
Yeah.
But of course, one of the liberating aspects of horror movies, or the sensation of horror in general, is that if you see it on a screen or read it in a book, you you kind of get more brave when it comes to facing it in real life.
Oh, yeah, that there's that exposure that
Yeah.
um yeah, not to
So
bring up like
that's why there's a link, I think, between horror and comedy so often.
oh, that's a good point. Yeah, because horror and comedy kind of combine together often like in Ash versus Evil Dead or something.
Yeah. And if you see a horror movie, it kind of disempowers, the evils that we face, and presumably the evils within ourselves as well. Or I
Yeah,
should say, it potentially does that. If we're using it correctly.
yeah. If we're not too traumatized by it, like the exposure to our own cortisol in smaller controlled doses kind of helps us have more mastery over those states of being.
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing is to just try to develop a philosophy that helps you to cope with life, and
Yeah.
that. Well, it's not too different from like um. Well, let's see how I should have. Well, like how you have a way of sort of routining your intake that you told me about earlier. If you've got sort of a
Yeah.
general plan and a basic philosophical approach to it, I think it makes it more of a safe experience.
Yeah. And I did write a section about protective factors and research ethics, that this is more of like a lifestyle choice or perhaps a career choice. But I've surrounded myself with a lot of mental health care professionals. So I
Yeah,
feel like I'm in a unique position to be well cared for while trying these altering substances, because my significant other, I asked her about, do I seem manic? And she said, no, I think you're just in a good mood and not used to it. Um, it's good to have that kind of feedback, to have that kind of support. And it feels like a real privilege, because not everyone's surrounded by kind mental health care professionals. Some people are with less kind ones or have had bad experiences.
yeah. So, what do you say about those who have no history of being involved with mental health counselors or whatever like that? Like I haven't been to a doctor since I've been like 17 years old or something like that.
Yeah. To those, I would say there's a lot of bad doctors and mental health care professionals, and a lot of bad systems. Like some people, they feel like there's an onus to try to find some relief in 6 sessions.
Yeah,
And so the whole premise of therapy is to only be 6 sessions long. And sometimes it takes people 10 sessions to even get to the real issue. Um, so I would say to those people that it's worth finding a good therapist. Sometimes it takes a few tries. I've had, I think, 10 or 11 therapists in my life, and I would say about a third of them were amazing, the best therapists that I could imagine. A third of them were adequate, and a third of them, I would say, were psychonoxious, even harmful.
yeah,
So if you run into a harmful person or a mediocre person, um, just remember it's still possible to find a great therapist.
yeah.
I
So,
think the same is true for medical doctors.
what are the best ways of finding one that's actually, not a quack or I guess a bad person?
Yeah. Well, therapy should have some feeling of empowerment and some relief. Um, but therapy can also feel like a lot of hard work, doing hard things, really looking at yourself in ways that you're not used to. Um, so finding a good therapist, does it feel safe enough with this
Yeah,
person to look at yourself in those ways? If it doesn't feel safe enough, then maybe they're too judging or too critical, or don't have enough unconditional positive regard, or are just too blank. Some therapists are just really blank and hide so much of themselves that it's hard to connect with them. So be aware of your needs, and
do
continuously
you think
talking about your
there's
needs makes sense.
you think
Yep.
there's any tendency to sort of force a conclusion, like about a person, like sort of
Yeah.
giving them
Yeah.
attributing to them a mental health problem that's probably not even really there, I
Yeah. I
guess?
actually have a kind of a big section on that, because when I was 18, I had a therapist who was hell bent on diagnosing me with autism. Um, And she was kind of a psychonoxious therapist. She said a lot of things that caused more harm than good.
Yeah.
Things like, "Are you sure you're not just saying that because you need more attention?" Or and she seemed generally annoyed by me. And during that time, I was pretty suicidal. Um, but she was very hell-bent on diagnosing me with autism, and I speculated with the therapist I had after her, Mac, who I name in the book. Um, I think that she was so hell-bent on saying that I had autism because she wanted to blame me for my inability to connect with her, and she wasn't able to see that some of the phrases she said were hurtful enough to make me not want to be open.
Yeah.
So it's easier to say I have autism than try to create a circumstance that's opening for me.
Yeah. When it comes to issues like, I would even say that suicide isn't necessarily always like as big of a mental, I guess, mental health problem as some people make it out to be. Because I think that in some cases, it has more to do with experiences or certain people that you're around that sort of can drive you into a depressive state. Because if you're around people who are constantly, calling you down and bullying you or something like that, I think it makes it much more plausible that you're going to be suicidal.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, quite often, like a lot of people have suicidal thoughts, but they might not actively be suicidal. It might be like a passing thing.
Yeah.
And therapists sometimes get so panicked by that that they'll stomp out the conversation before it can even happen.
I think I don't remember which classes it was, but it might have even been like a class on politics, but they would refer to a master status of somebody, like this person is this and they're nothing else. So I think that can happen with a person who is suicidal, or if they have some other mental illness where you see them as just that, and you don't really look at, how, in which ways society or, family or the people they hang around with might actually help create that person's problem.
Yes.
So it's like the onus is solely on the person undergoing the mental health issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And like minor interventions like validation or unconditional positive regard or accurate empathy, those all help create a better therapeutic experience. But the therapist that I had, who was so hyperfixated on autism, couldn't treat me because she couldn't stop looking at diagnosis.
Yeah.
She was just unwilling to treat me until she found some diagnostic term.
So how did you get out of that situation then?
I just called the office several days before I had the appointment, and I just canceled and never went back.
Yeah. Was this in high school or?
No, this was in college.
Okay.
And then I found another therapist named Mac, who was one of the best therapists I'd ever had, maybe the greatest. He's very influential on my life.
Yeah.
But he was also able to be unconventional.
It is refreshing to hear about, therapists in a positive light, because I think there's this idea that, therapy is just a waste of time and money. That seems to be a lot of the messaging that I get about it.
Yeah, and I can see that if like in more managed care sessions where people aren't really getting treatment. I have an excerpt I could read about Mac. Mac was my first great therapist. I had him when I was 20 years old and felt like I could talk about suicide. Every therapist before him seemed profoundly annoyed by my suicidal ideation. I was asked questions such as, "Are you sure you're not just saying that for attention?" And, "Am I going to have to worry about you?" The accusatory tone within those questions always closed me off, further cementing in my mind that others are more interested in checking boxes than understanding me. Mac once said to me, "In these situations, therapists like to contract for safety. We can do that now. But what I think you really need is to be able to talk about this. Say what's on your mind, and we can go back to contacting for safety a little later. I told Mac I was too depressed to consider suicide. We both laughed. I told Mac everything about my previous treatments. Mac said, I think too many people showed you they weren't trustworthy, and you started to wonder, maybe no one is trustworthy. So Mac had this real talent for giving like kind of basic summaries, but making them seem very profound in a way that was helpful to me. It gave me a sense of, it made me believe in treatment, that there can be relief from this.
Well, this is going to be a weird analogy, but in a way that's kind of reminding me of how I actually finally passed an algebra class, because it was really to do with my attitude about it. I still don't like algebra, but at one point I finally realized, you know what, I've got to finally just accept this and, not see it as boring, because that was really one of the main things that I had against it, is just my attitude of it being boring, and that it's completely against my my nature to really care about math or whatever.
Yeah, I think we had the same algebra teacher, not at the same time, but assuming it's the same person, I remember that teacher, because I really struggled in algebra in 9th grade, and no one figured out why, because I could do certain problems in my head, and then other problems I seemed to be clueless about how to solve, even though they were the same basic formula. She had me write down my problems, the math problems, and she would follow along, and she noticed that I tended to chunk steps together. Like I would just naturally add or move numbers around in a way that made sense to me. And then sometimes that would cause me to skip steps. And sometimes that would work and I could figure out the problem mentally in my head. And then other times I would just get way confused and not understand. So she made me go through every step. She stopped me from skipping steps. And I think that kind of attention and finding what exactly my personal problem was with math helped me. And it seemed like it helped you too.
Well, for me, like, the problem continued into college or the university that I went to. And it took me a number of tries, but I think really what helped me get through it was just realizing that I had to stop being emotionally reactive to it. Because I just had negative emotions about math and I hated it. So I stopped being less emotional about the whole thing.
Okay, yeah.
And that kind of reminds me of, like what we were talking about with therapists.
Yeah, so therapists have to look at the person individually, but also almost like understand that person's, I don't know if I'd say cultural references, but like the worldview where these thoughts and feelings are generating from. So the underlying schemas as to why they're there.
Yeah.
So like Mac really mentioned, he really harped on how distrusting I am of people.
Yeah.
He picked that up right away. I don't think the therapist I had before him realized how much I distrusted others. I think she just assumed that I trusted her enough to disclose.
Yeah. Well, I'm similar in that regard too.
Yeah.
And then that is partly due to that's partly due to my own childhood, of course, being around somebody who was an alcoholic and bipolar, and who threatened to go on shooting sprees and stuff like that. That certainly had like an impact on my ability to trust others' judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when you have that setup from childhood, in early adulthood, your mind's prompted to always look for untrustworthy things because they're a source of danger and you want to be safe. So you'll naturally just pick up on people being not trustworthy.
Oh yeah, well, like when a lot of the times if people are like nice to me, I don't trust them. I would almost rather them be hostile. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because they're more equipped to deal with their hostility than you are to deal with their subterfuge.
Yeah. It's kind of a weird problem, but it also
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is I don't see it totally as a bad thing. Like I haven't totally ended that sort of way of viewing things, but I've augmented it now that I understand that not everybody fits into that. It's just certain people. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like an informed and cautious pessimism, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
And I think I think that if there's one thing I want to, get across about that is that you can have certain pessimistic aspects to your personality without getting too overboard with it. Like it does make sense at a certain point to distrust people, but at the same time you have to take the good with the bad.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's finding out who's trustworthy to disclose this segment of my life with. I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
Because I can feel pretty trustworthy. I can trust my boss quite a bit, but I don't know that I would necessarily trust her with everything.
Yeah, and you know what? There's another thing about that too. Once we're talking so much about the mind and behavior and stuff, I think what also helps me is that understanding that certain things are to do with mental illness, or however you want to phrase it, just the chemical reactions in a person's brain or something like that. It kind of makes you understand that it's not always your fault that certain people don't like you, or that you don't like certain people. Like sometimes it can just be related to the unique conditions of a person's life during that time, and the things that are very difficult to actually take track of and manage. So certain experiences are going to be beyond your control. So boy, I don't know where I'm going with this at this point, but I guess that kind of settles it right there.
Yeah, maybe being okay with negativity, that there's going to be some negativity
Yeah,
in the relationships that you choose to keep, and it's okay to accept some negativity that you can draw boundaries and prevent it from encroaching too much on your life.
exactly. Something like that. Well, on that note, I think we are going to wrap things up here because we've been chatting for a little while. And so hopefully people out there enjoyed at least portions of this. And is there anything you'd like to say to end it?
No, I guess I said what I needed to say.
Yeah. Well, have a nice life.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to wrap things up. Bye-bye.
Bye.